Thank you for joining us for Turning Anger into Action, What Happened to Anton Black. My name is Lauren Pierce, Marketing Director for Sandy Spring Museum. During these very difficult times that we have all been experiencing as individuals and as a country, the museum as an organization too has been experiencing challenges, grappling with the role we play in a system that benefits some at the expense of others. Sandy Spring Museum stands firmly with those fighting against the racism, structural disadvantages, and systemic injustice that have oppressed Black people in the United States for hundreds of years. The United States was built on discriminatory practices that were codified in our legal system, beginning with the dehumanization of Native people, followed by enslaving Black people in bondage as property for the financial benefit of white European ancestry. Sandy Spring Museum stands on land that was once a plantation where Black people were enslaved. We recognize that the museum is the beneficiary of an historically unjust system. We are committed to working towards dismantling systems that perpetuate racism and discrimination in order to build a just, equal society. Tonight's program is one of many programs we will be hosting that challenge the dominant narrative. With that, I would like to turn it over to our partners, Isaac and Kevin, with Brothers with Books.
Thank you, Lauren. So welcome to Turning Anger into Action, brought to you by Sandy Spring Museum, Brothers with Books, the hub for culture and democracy. I'm Kevin.
I'm Isaac, and tonight we wanted to have a conversation that was different than the other ones. You know, a lot of the times when you turn on your news, you've heard of George Floyd, you've heard of Breonna Taylor, rightfully so, you've heard these names, but when it comes to our community and the things that happen in our state, people are oblivious to it. And we wanted to have a conversation that, one, reminded you and affirmed that the people that are dying are human beings. They're not just these occurrences that happen, but they're people, and they're people that you should know more about and care about because their dignity mattered. So in this conversation, we're going to be learning more about Anton Black, Anton's law, and what other legislation Marylanders should be aware of. But we want to remind you that the presenters on this panel are solely responsible for the information being shared, and they do not represent the views of associated organizations or institutions unless they say so.
So to keep background noise to a minimum, please be sure once again that you mute your microphones and have your videos off. So right now is a good time to mute it if you haven't already. And also use the chat respectfully. There are no stupid questions. We're all here to learn and grow, and we're all here to turn anger into action.
Yeah. So, and tonight we'd be remiss if we didn't take time to just honor the fact that we have such amazing panelists today. I mean, we've been so pumped for this conversation. We have Monty Cooper, who's counsel at Crowell and Mooring, who, I mean, you all will see for yourself, an amazing speaker with an amazing experience and ties. And then our panelists, we are so honored to have an activist and a leader, as well as Anton Black's sister, who can share more about that dignity and that humanity piece that I was talking about earlier. We have Delegate Acevero, who is delegate representing the District 39, who sponsored Anton's law the past 2 years and will do so again in the future. And hopefully he won't have to sponsor it again because it'll be passed. And Delegate Pam Queen, who's the delegate representing District 14, who has a long history of roots in Montgomery County and has so much wisdom to share with us. And then our very own council member, Jawando, who is a MoCo council member who really doesn't need an introduction, but we're so honored to have him here tonight as well. So we just like to turn it over to Monty Cooper to kick us off.
Thank you, Isaac, and thank you, Kevin. This is a wonderful opportunity. I want to thank Sandy Spring Museum as well. Just listening to Lauren talk at the beginning about sort of the purpose of this and what the museum's mission is, having this conversation, it reminds me that probably one of the most important things we can sort of get out of everything that's happened in relation to George Floyd and sort of how police interact with the African-American community is for us to be very honest about the history. And as it relates to African-Americans really and sort of the world we inherit. And if we're honest and understand that history, we can really move forward with solutions to help us address some of these problems. So thank you to Sandy Spring. I'm here in Prince George's County, actually, so I'm not from Montgomery County, but you know, these issues are important all around the country, and we have a history here in Prince George's with police interacting with communities of color. So I appreciate being able to sort of moderate this discussion, but listen to what's going on in a neighboring county there in Montgomery County. So really thank you for the opportunity. With that, we are in Montgomery County, and we have obviously outstanding elected officials. Those of us in Prince George's have heard about all of the folks who are here on the panel, so we appreciate their time. Councilmember Jawando, I'll ask just very briefly, could you share a little bit about what is being done on the county level there in Montgomery County to address police brutality and misconduct? And then how can community members be a part of those programs, initiatives?
Sure. Thank you, Monty. It's great to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. Great to see Delegate Queen and Delegate Acevero and Ms. Black. Thank you for being here. And so sorry for your loss and continued loss. I know that doesn't go away or get any easier over time, LaToya. So thank you for your advocacy. We're doing several things, and I'll try to be concise so that we can get to many questions and get to colleagues. I'll go in chronological order. Just 2 weeks ago, I drafted a bill along with all the members of color on the council, Councilmembers Albanaz, Navarro, and Rice, that we introduced related to use of force, which will do many of the things that are really urgently needed. They're the baseline, they're the start, the beginning of things that we need to outlaw and require to keep people safe and to reduce violence, police violence. And it'll do several things. And it's made its way through committee. We're gonna vote on it next week on Tuesday. So one of the answers is you can make sure you advocate for these changes at the county level, but also at the state level. It'll ban no-knock warrants, the types that killed Breonna Taylor and have killed residents in Montgomery County. And have terrified and actually been responsible for the death of police officers as well. They're not safe. It's not a safe tactic. It'll ban chokeholds. It'll ban striking individuals who are restrained. We've had instances of that happen in Montgomery County. When I saw George Floyd, in addition to being horrified at his murder and watching that inhumanity for almost 9 minutes, I thought about a case we had in Montgomery County where a young man was handcuffed and restrained and kneed in the neck and the head. So he started bleeding, and then a shirt was pulled over his face. And the officer was thankfully charged with assault. But if you saw that case, you saw two things. One, where the officer could have killed that young man. And two, that you had officers standing around doing nothing during the whole exchange. And so I say that to say that people think that Montgomery County is a great place. I've been here my whole life. I love it. We are not immune. We are not immune. We have the same roots of the poisonous tree of systemic racism and anti-Blackness that have led to all of our systems being racist, including police violence. So it'll ban that type of activity. It'll also require a duty to intervene and protect officers who do when they see an officer committing a crime or misusing their office or using excessive force. And then very importantly, it'll raise the standard for the use of deadly force from one now, which is reasonable, if a reasonable officer thinks that they can use that force, to that is necessary as a last resort to protect life. And that's a change in the legal standard and requires the use of de-escalation and reasonable alternatives so that we can have less likelihood of these types of fatal encounters. And that's been shown in places like Seattle to reduce police-involved death greatly. So that's a very important set of policies, but it's only the beginning. We also declared racism a public health emergency, resolution I authored a few weeks back, because we die in many ways due to racism, whether it's in hospitals or on our roads because our communities have been disinvested in, and certainly from police violence at the highest rate of anybody. So those are some of the steps we've taken. Last thing I'll mention is on August 1st, thanks to the work that we did last year, led by Councilmember Navarro and with the support of everyone on the council, we passed a landmark racial equity bill that will require us to have, starting August 1st, every policy, every bill, every budgetary item we consider will have to have a racial equity statement attached to it. The important thing here is that, similar to getting a fiscal analysis, and my state legislators will know this, you get a note on it, it shows you what the impact could be. We're gonna have a racial equity analysis. Now, where does the community come in? Just because you have the information doesn't mean you act on it. When you're trying to disentangle hundreds of years of systemic racism baked into every law and policy we have, you're going to have to make some pretty dramatic changes to do that. And so we're going to need you all to keep us accountable and hold us accountable and push us to act on that information and make the investments in the laws and the policy change that we're going to need to make. So those are a few of the things that we've done. Much more to do in policing, much more to do in all these areas, but I'll pause there just to allow for you to ask other questions.
Thank you, Councilmember. We appreciate that. I think what we'll do, I know you may have a little bit of time to remain, but I want to get to LaToya and have her share a little bit about Anton and just talk a little bit about Anton's law. Delegate Acevero is going to talk a little bit more about the law in particular, but just tell us a little bit about Anton. Tonight, we're here to talk about Anton's law in particular at the state level. So we appreciate your thoughts, LaToya. You're on mute, LaToya.
How's that? Okay, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, Anton, he was the baby of our family, the youngest out of 9. He had 4 sisters and 4 brothers. He actually had a unique circumstance, being the baby and having siblings as old as some of us are. He actually had nieces and nephews that are older than he is. And then he had sets of nieces and nephews that were born after he was. So he was really into his family, loved his family, into sports. He actually excelled in basketball, football, and he actually ran track as well. Anything he put his mind to, Anton could accomplish it. He did not set any limitations on himself. His family, we never told him he couldn't do anything that he put his mind to, no matter what it was. He had aspirations of being a model and an actor. He was actually successfully accomplishing those goals. Anton has walked the New York Fashion Week. Anton has booked other shows and print articles and things like that. So he was actually getting jobs for his modeling career, and he was supposed to go to Milan. He was actually, a fashion designer was looking for him, and found out through Facebook that he had been killed by the police. Sorry. Yeah, he was just an amazing young man. Everyone loved him, so easy to love. He was actually active in his community. He was part of different programs in his community. He actually was active with the police department in his community. So that, you know, that's something for us that's kind of hard considering the circumstances, what happened to him. Knew the mayor, would dine at the mayor's dinner table with his family. Anton was the type of kid that any parent would say, you know what, if I wasn't home and my child called and said, you know, Anton's here, Anton could come in. Like they said they didn't mind for Anton to be there if they weren't home. Amazing young man, amazing young man. He actually also was working with young kids in his community with sports. He excelled as much as he did. And track and football. He was helping out other young men who were interested in playing sports. Well-rounded, in my opinion. Funny as I don't know what. He was hilarious. My mother always said she always compared the two of us because I'm her first and he's her last. But yeah, he's such an amazing young man, and what happened to him shouldn't have. He knew who he was dealing with. I'm just going to say Anton knew who he was dealing with. He actually had brought to our mother's attention that one of the officers was coming, Webster was coming to Greensboro. My mother had no idea who he was, but Anton, he knew who he was and what he had done previously. So it's difficult. You know, it's still difficult to talk about what's happened, but it's so important for us to do so because no one ever imagines that this is going to happen to someone you know. We see it, you see it, and we see it so much now. Sometimes I think some of us become desensitized to it until all the recent events that's been going on. Thankfully, it's bringing more attention to police in custody or out of custody, brutality, murders, whether we're getting shot or smothered, in my opinion, or choked, is what you want to call it. We definitely need to bring more attention to what's going on. One of the reasons for Anton's Law is to bring police accountability to, well, for example, Webster had over 30 excessive force of abuse complaints against him. And the fact that we had to fight as hard as we did to get the information about what happened to Anton. Like, Anton was killed on September 18th. We didn't know or receive anything as far as his autopsy was concerned until Governor Hogan got involved. So that, and from my understanding, the toxicology was done within 5 days. So why did you hold on for 4 months? You held on to this information and you didn't give us anything until the governor was asked about it and he actually chimed in. That's when we start getting answers. So that is one part that Anton's Law is going to cover, is to help for accountability. If there is a force of use record, the public should be able to access those records. So that also is part of it, and as well as the Law Office's Bill of Rights. Delegate Acevero, he's of course going to know a lot more about it and can speak more eloquently about the law. But it's definitely covering as many bases as we would like to be covered. We're trying to get some answers for other families that may have issues with other law enforcement or with law enforcement officers, period. And then we don't want to Anton. They tried to sweep it under the rug, point blank. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. They tried to sweep what happened to him under the rug. There's a lot of corruption going on right now. There's a lot that needs to be done, and you know, we're fighting. We're fighting as hard as we can to try to get some type of justice for Anton. The law is going to help other families. It's not going to so much do anything for Anton now, but if we can help others in the future, you know, to minimize just the fight. It's already traumatic to lose a loved one to the way that you do, as far as the way that we have, as far as what happened to Anton. A lot of people don't like me to say it, but I say he was murdered. I don't care what his autopsy says. He was murdered. He was murdered in front of our mother. And no one should have to go through that. Not only, you know, our mother seeing what happened to her son, but the way that Anton died, he didn't deserve to die that way. I don't care what they thought happened. It doesn't matter what narrative they try to spin, and we see it in the news. They try to spin something to try to justify what happened, and a lot of times it doesn't even hold water. But Anton didn't deserve to die like that, and the police officers need to be accountable, and we definitely we have them running scared because the unions are fighting. The police unions are fighting against us very hard about getting this law passed, and they're coming up with all excuses under the sun. And a lot of times it's the same exact excuse, and to me, it doesn't hold much water at all. It's just adults making excuses as to why they can't do the right thing and trying to justify these reasons, which are nonsensical. These are public servants. I mean, there's certain things about their interactions with the public that we should be made aware of, and that we should have access to. But You're welcome.
LaToya, I really appreciate that. It just listening to you, your Anton was a life. He was a fully living human being with aspirations and goals, and to have his life end in this way is it's tough. It's tragic, and it's tough to hear. And we know about George Floyd. We know about Breonna Taylor. We should know more about your brother. And so this is an opportunity, I think, to do that. So we appreciate you sharing. It's funny, just listening to all of you talk, there's so much that all of us, we're aware of some things, but then we learn so much more about other things. Councilmember Jawando talking about chokeholds and sort of raising the standard for deadly force. Those are important issues to correcting the problem. And then, of course, information sharing. All these things I think the public at large doesn't really know that are problems, but now we realize that certainly they are through your brother's life. And so it's important that we address these issues. I say all of that as a segue to Delegate Acevero. If you can talk a little bit about Anton's Law and sort of what it is and the challenges ahead too, in terms of getting it passed, and then what can we as a community do to help pass it? You are on mute, I think. Say something, unmute it, and then now say something. Can't hear you. We maybe have some technical difficulties there. I don't know if others can hear Delegate Acevero.
And you can hear Gabe when he talks. And I say that I mean that in a good way.
Well, here's what we'll try and do. Well, I don't know if Councilmember Jawando or Delegate Queen.
Maybe go to Delegate Queen.
Delegate Queen, can you talk a little bit about the about Anton's Law as best you can, and then we'll see if we can get Delegate Acevero back on.
Okay, so I don't know the law as well as Delegate Acevero does, but it is a law that is going to help bring more accountability on police actions. We have certainly tried to do things like this in the past. We actually passed in 2016 a major police accountability bill. And so my understanding is going to, again, as LaToya mentioned it. And LaToya, I want to recognize your incredible loss, and we thank you for being here. But the couple of things that she mentioned is to make sure information is available to the families or individuals quickly. One of the issues that have been raised with the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights is that there's too much time for statements to time between incidents and when statements are made by police officers, when those records can be provided, how much information can be shared with the public. There's laws and protections and understanding that as an individual, police have certain levels of protection that they need, and the union is looking to make sure those things are in place. But we have to try to find the balance of when those protections are limiting our ability to look into the actions of police from a standpoint that these are considered more criminal acts. And so the legislation is going to allow for us to get records of police officers' past behavior, but personnel records. That's been another issue that has been raised. The ability for the public to see some of the information that's in their personnel records. So as you can imagine, that's going to be a area where we're going to have to reach some sort of balance. And also the ability to address some of these issues from a criminal aspects. So could we prosecute police for some of these actions? And so that's where we're seeing a lot of the conversation going now. We're seeing some work in the House that the Speaker of the House has formed this police accountability work group that's going to look at a framework for investigating police misconduct. They're going to look at statewide use of force rules. They're going to look at how to deal with body cameras and some independent prosecution of law enforcement crimes and misconduct. So that's a very important work group. Delegate Acevero is actually on that work group along with Delegate Moon, who's also from Montgomery County. It's comprised of about 13 members, Republicans, Democrats, members of the Legislative Black Caucus, who are all looking at these issues of police misconduct and how we can have some statewide sort of guidance that can be used so that we can address many of these issues that we're seeing. So I'm really hopeful that the outcome of that work group, and certainly I'm sure Delegate Acevero is going to, bring Anton's law as part of the dialogue for that group, will be helpful to getting some meaningful change in police accountability.
We have Delegate Acevero back, and we'll let him.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Go ahead.
Yeah, so first, thank you to the Sandy Spring Museum and to Brothers with Books for organizing and facilitating this discussion, and to you, Monty, for moderating it. It's certainly a discussion that's long overdue, but a discussion that we've been having many times over with people in power as well as with the rest of America, and that is the issue of racialized policing here in the United States. And when we talk about Anton Black, who Anton Black was really all of us. Anton Black was me. This was a young man that was talented, he was gifted, he was smart, he was funny, he was an expectant father, he was excelling academically and pursuing so many other things. And he had his entire life ahead of him. And it was cut short by someone, as LaToya rightly pointed out, who not only had multiple use of force reports during his time with the Dover, Delaware Police Department, but this was someone who in essence was protected by the system, was allowed to remain in the system, and was not decertified. And so when you have problem officers that have a track record of use of force, that have a track record of engaging in racial profiling or use of excessive force against citizens, we have to ensure that we're rooting out those cops. We have to ensure that we're providing proper oversight and accountability, and we're being as responsive to the community so that the community in turn trusts the way public safety is done. And that wasn't the case. Here you have Webster, who was a former officer in Delaware and was, in essence, caught on dash cam video kicking an unarmed Black man unconscious. That angered the community and brought second-degree assault charges. When the video was released, it ended up going viral. It was national. A number of national news agencies were reporting on this. The case was being watched. The NAACP in Delaware was making demands of the state legislature as well as of elected leaders. And what we ended up seeing was Webster was not only not found guilty of these second-degree charges because it was dismissed, but he was given a hefty severance package of close to $250,000, and he was not decertified as a law enforcement officer. And what do I mean by that? Law enforcement officers are certified, and unless they are decertified, if an officer engages in alleged misconduct or if it is shown that this officer engaged in misconduct and was relieved of his or her or their duties, if they are not decertified, it means they could go 2 towns over or to another state and be hired and engage in the same problematic racist behavior that caused the death or the harm of someone in the community, as we saw not just with Anton Black, but with Tamir Rice and with so many other law enforcement officers who not only engage in excessive or deadly force, but are protected by the system and allowed to remain on the force. And so Webster, when he was let go from the Dover Police Department, what he did, like every other officer that isn't decertified, he crossed state lines into Maryland, and he was hired by the Greensboro Police Department, despite the community expressing concerns about hiring him. Some members of the community actually knew about his record in Delaware, and they expressed a lot of concerns that if he were to be hired, that someone of color in their community would end up dead. And these were the concerns that they were sharing with town officials who afterwards decided that they were going to hire him. And the police chief at the time, Michael Pato, who hired Webster, was recently indicted by the Maryland State Prosecutor's Office for misconduct in office for lying on his application about the multiple use of force reports that he had while an officer in Delaware. And so we see how the system is not only allowing someone like Webster to continue, but to be protected and to be allowed to work in a police department somewhere else. And what ended up happening was weeks later, Anton Black was chased down. He was pinned down. He was arrested. You know, this happened right in front of his mother's house. And, you know, it's really heart-wrenching to sort of go over what happened to him. But this young man was not only, the force that was used was not only unnecessary, was not only excessive, but he was killed right in front of his mother. And when we think about something like that, right, that your mother could be looking at you feeling helpless and trying to explain the situation, and there's no kind of a discussion, there's no kind of a, well, let's try to figure out what's going on here. It's just, we need to be using this level of force. We are seeing him as a threat to the community, even though he didn't pose a threat whatsoever. And because of that, you know, Anton, who was struggling and was, you know, calling out for his mother and saying that he was having, you know, issues breathing, later became unconscious and died. And what we ended up seeing after that was some town officials began to quell the questions that were coming from the community about his death and investigation. You see what was a cover-up, in my opinion, where you know, they were not only shutting down debate on Anton Black's death, but they were not willing to provide any information to the family and to the community that raised him. And so the Coalition for Justice for Anton Black was formed. LaToya, Holley, his mother, his father, and a number of other community leaders not only ensured that they were raising attention around his death, but they were calling for the answers that everyone should have when they request that information from law enforcement. And they did not receive that. There was no kind of an information that was being provided to the family about his death and where they were in terms of the investigation. All they knew that this officer was still on the beat. They had to fight in order to get this officer out of the police department. And mind you, this is a small police department in a small, close-knit community. So everyone knew who this officer was and who was responsible you know, for not just arresting, but contributing to Anton Black's death. And it wasn't just Webster, it was a number of off-duty officers that were also involved in this. And so there was a cover-up, not just in terms of quelling the debate and ensuring the family didn't get any answers, but we also saw that, you know, they weren't willing to provide the information to the community until the governor, Hogan, had said publicly that the family had deserved answers and accountability. And so at that point, that is when they started releasing some information about what happened, such as the autopsy, the footage, etc. And it should have never come to that. And so when we talk about complainants seeking information and requesting information and not getting that, that has to be standard. And so Anton's law in large part addresses a number of things that the family and the community were calling for, but did not get, that led to his death. And one is the release of information. So Anton's law addresses the Maryland Public Information Act. And what it requires is that a complainant would receive a copy of the investigative file upon conclusion of that investigation, as well as any prior complaints made against this officer, both sustained and unsustained. And the reason why this is important when we talk about sustained and unsustained complaints is that police departments investigate themselves. So when complaints are brought against the public, majority of the time, these complaints are deemed as unsustained because it's police departments, in essence, investigating and exonerating each other. And so why it's important in this situation to have both sustained and unsustained complaints is that we can establish a pattern of abusive behavior, a pattern of use of excessive force, a pattern that the department and other folks should flag and try to root out these officers that engage in these multiple use of force cases, as we saw with George Floyd and so many others, right? And so Anton's law addresses that first and foremost. Secondly, what it does is it repeals a provision of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. And for folks who aren't familiar with the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, Maryland was the first state in the 1970s to pass the LEOBR. So we, in essence, gave America the blueprint on how to protect corrupt and racist cops. And this law, called the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, in essence gives privileges, not rights, privileges to law enforcement officers well above the rights that you and I as ordinary citizens have. Good example, that an officer can only be interrogated by another sworn officer, meaning there's no kind of an oversight, civilian oversight or accountability because it's officers investigating officers. Another good example, it gives officers a 5-day cooling off period, right? Where they have 5 days before they can speak to an investigator or anyone about alleged misconduct. It also shields certain things, whether it's personnel files, whether it's, the disciplinary process, in essence, impeding the kind of a transparency and accountability that our communities are calling for. So Anton's law, another thing that it does, it repeals a provision of the LEOBR that says only sworn officers can investigate and interrogate other sworn officers. And the reason why that is important is because civilian review boards are the way that public is able to participate and ensure that there's oversight. But we see some jurisdictions like Baltimore City creating a civilian review board, but these civilian review boards are in essence weak because the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights says that only an officer can investigate and interrogate another sworn officer. And so the work that civilian review boards would otherwise do in terms of oversight, accountability, subpoena powers, they are unable to do because this law prevents them. And so that's why you have the Civilian Review Board in Baltimore City, while it is a good structure and a good start, largely is unable to do what the community is calling for in terms of oversight and accountability. And lastly, what Anton's law would do is it would establish a statewide use of force standard. And the reason why these three things are important in the case of Anton Black is because one, the family was asking for information and they didn't get it. No one should have to wait or beg elected officials to get involved in a situation like this in order for the family and the community to get information. That has to be standard. Secondly, the lack of oversight and accountability. The community was showing up to town meetings and having to hold town officials accountable who weren't willing to provide information or what kind of action was taken. And so we need to ensure that we're empowering civilian review boards so that communities have a greater say in how public safety is administered. And lastly, we know that the use of force is important when it comes to Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people because we are disproportionately the recipients of excessive use of force by law enforcement, as we saw with the case of Anton Black. And so we need to establish statewide use of force standards with criminal implications for officers that use excessive or deadly force without that being justified. And that's part of the problem, right? officers use excessive and deadly force, and we're unable to hold those individuals accountable because of current law or qualified immunity, or whatever other current law that prevents prosecutors from doing and bringing cases. And lastly, I want to point out, because we talk about independent prosecutors and investigators. Anton, the state's attorney for Caroline County, and correct me if I'm wrong, LaToya, but the state's attorney for Caroline County not only declined to indict Webster, but all the officers that were involved in Anton Black's arrest and death. And this is really important because when we talk about the national prosecution rate of law enforcement, it hovers around 1%. We see instances where state's attorneys either do not bring charges, state's attorneys or district attorneys do not bring charges, or when they do, it is difficult to prosecute that. And I think by establishing use of force standards, we are now providing prosecutors with a roadmap and a rubric where, you know, if officers breach that use of force standard, there are criminal implications, and that's why it's important.
Well, thank you, Delegate. We appreciate that. There are so many questions to ask about all of this, particularly about how complaints are investigated now. It looks like it's one sworn officer investigating another sworn officer. It looks like the bill addresses that. Yeah, that's it. I want to move the Delegate Queen and just have her talk a little bit about what other initiatives the General Assembly is considering as it relates to use of force, as it relates to police and policing our communities.
Yes, so also I should have said before, thank you Sandy Spring Museum and Brothers with Books and the Hub for Culture and Democracy for this invitation to talk to you and engage the community on this very important topic. As I alluded to before, the House, as I alluded to, has a police accountability work group that's working on many of these issues. Also, the Senate, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Procedure Committee is Senator Will Smith, who's also from Montgomery County. And he has also mentioned, he's put out a letter that says that he's going to look at a lot of the issues that are the crux of why we're seeing some of the problems with police accountability throughout the country, not only in Maryland, but this concept of having disclosure of the officers' personnel records, that's one of the key issues. The way officers are trained, we often hear about this use of force and this idea of using and not de-escalating first before they come to a use of force issue or get to that place, because the officers are trained once they pull their weapon, they are to shoot to kill. So we need to have processes in place so that that would be the last straw in many of these cases. We also have a concern about the militarization of police forces. We've seen a ramp up of a lot more equipment and SWAT teams and things that have made police less of public servants, but almost just combatants with the community. And so we want to look at those kind of issues. Bystander intervention. We should not have other police that are sitting around or standing by and seeing an officer use excessive force and not intervene. I think one of the key pieces of it, also legislation that deals with having some special prosecutor for police violence. We need to look at these issues as more of crimes like they would be if it was another individual, and make sure that we address them as such. So that's kind of where we are now in the aftermath. In 2016, after the tragic death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore City, I don't know if you remember that story. I mean, he was in police custody, but we had a panel formed then to start looking at police accountability. And so that law made a first step at changing some of the policy on how police are disciplined and how they're trained, and even looking at some of the hiring practices for police. that's what opened up, as Delegate Acevero mentioned, in Baltimore City, where they have civilians now on the review board for that. This is certainly an area where we can deal with get better at that, or make sure that's widely used in a way that those civilians have, they're non-voting at this point, and so to make sure that they have more say and more responsibility and input into that board. But it did open that complaints could be done anonymously, and that these trial board proceedings can be open to the public. So those are some of the key things that we're seeing that will have to be done, and we're moving towards that to make that happen in the state.
Appreciate that, Delegate Queen. We've got a few questions that have come in. I'm going to ask one question, and then I'll get to some of the other questions we've had here. And I think this touches a little bit on Anton's law as it relates to sort of repealing a section of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. But when I was growing up, I think all of us, if you're African American or you're a person of color, you've had the talk with your parents, and I certainly had it with my father. And the biggest thing about the talk, at least our talk, was you comply, you do whatever you can to get out of the situation, and then file a complaint later, and you can let the law sort of deal with it after the fact. But I get the sense from you, and I'm listening to you, Delegate Acevero, that you can raise a complaint, you can raise multiple complaints, but this all falls on deaf ears, these complaints do. So as it exists now, if you file a complaint, how many complaints, what's the standard for decertification of a police officer in Maryland? And how many police officers are decertified over like a several year period of time? I mean, what kind of, any thoughts there or answers there?
Yes, so I have requested from the Maryland State Police information about how many decertifications they have done over the past few years. And I believe they sent that information to me, or they may not have, but that is something that's critical to us understanding more about not just the issue of police violence, but the kind of actions that we need to take. And I think we have certainly done some things in the aftermath of Freddie Gray's death. But what we did was not enough in terms of addressing the issue of police violence more holistically. And I think in part it has to do with political will. I think in part it also has to do with the kind of an opposition there is in Annapolis to police transparency and accountability, particularly by police unions like the Fraternal Order of Police or other unions, as well as at times by the Maryland Police Chiefs and Sheriffs Association. And so what this requires is all of us shifting our focus and our attention to Annapolis to ensure that we're getting the kind of policies that our communities have been calling for decades. Let me be clear, what I am calling for in Anton's law, what I am calling for with the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights is nothing new. People before me have been calling for it. I actually have copies of legislation from legislators who, when they served in the House, was putting in bills around MPIA and the LEOBR. So this is an issue that has been going on for a really long time. And the moment to have done something was decades ago, but the moment where not only was the environment charged, but the political will and the will of the people was there was when Freddie Gray was killed. And we didn't do enough. And we have to be willing to acknowledge that, because this is a discussion that we have been having for too long in America. When we talk about the inception of law enforcement agencies in this country from slave patrols, when we talk about the fact that Ida B. Wells, had it not been for her, the rest of the country and the world would not know the level of brutalization that Black people in the South were experiencing at the hands of law enforcement. Had it not been for people like Paul Robeson, the Civil Rights Congress, putting out the document titled "We Charge Genocide" to the United Nations, detailing incidences of police violence against Black Americans between 1945 and 1951. Had it not been for Dr. King and Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panther Party, and then we talk about the 70s and the 80s with the push around there, and Amadou Diallo's death, and Rodney King. We have been having this conversation for centuries, and we've been calling for the very same things for decades. And so what we must ask ourselves is, what is it about our issues, particularly issues that disproportionately impact Black and brown people in this state and this country, that those in power and the power structure is not willing to respond the way they should to our concerns and to the impacted communities? We have to be honest about that first and foremost, because after Freddie Gray was killed, Corinne Gaines in Baltimore County was shot and killed by the Baltimore County Police Department with her child in her hand. The Baltimore County is now facing a $30-something million suit that they would have to pay. And that's another discussion that we need to be having, is how police settlements are paid out. Because when you have these rogue officers and corrupt officers that engage in this kind of behavior, the people who are left footing the bill are you and I in terms of these police settlements. And that is another discussion that we need to be having. But I think I'm optimistic about this work group, and I appreciate the speaker for creating it and for appointing me and a number of my colleagues to it. But I've also made it very clear that we need to go as far as we can and pass as comprehensive of a legislation as we can, so that we're finally addressing the issue of police violence holistically.
This is all good information. A question that we had that came in, and there's been a lot of talk about defunding the police, which I think sort of a corollary to that is sort of reimagining the police and sort of how law enforcement or the public, our government officials, respond to crises that happen. And so, Delegate Queen, this is kind of a question for you: is, in terms of law, outside of Anton's law, is there any strategic planning or sort of initiatives being thought about on having first responders be sort of other than police officers, have more mental health workers involved early on in sort of crises that happen in the public?
Yes, so that's been a conversation. We've dealt with that more. We've talked about that in Montgomery County some because of the nature of some of our more recent use of force issues. One of the problems that we're seeing, and one of the reasons why it is very important to get statewide legislation, is because you find that in different counties, things are handled very differently. So Montgomery County had tried to have this process where they would have sort of a triage of support. So depending on the type of issue, police would come in, but they also were going to be supported with those who are trained in addressing mental health crises. And so that's a model that they're trying to use. They aren't using it 100%, and it still needs to be worked out. But that's a model that people are starting to talk about. We're certainly starting to talk about the incredible range of calls that police are having to deal with and having to address, and are they properly trained to handle these sorts of issues? And so how should we integrate the concept of mental illness and those who can be more involved with helping to diffuse a crisis situation that aren't law enforcement type? The idea of at the recent issue that happened in Baltimore City, where the police were it was Baltimore City, not county. Baltimore City, where the police were called in by the family to address, some of the issues. One of the things that people talked about was the police came down to talk to this man, and he was backed in the corner. And of course, that's going to make someone feel, threatened or feel as though they need to lash out. And that's just not the type of environment you have when someone has sort of a mental break. And so we are definitely looking at that. The county has been looking at it, but certainly now from a state standpoint of looking at how to integrate into the police force responses that deal with the mental illness issues.
We appreciate that, Delegate Queen. The next question, Delegate Acevero, is for you. Can you talk about how Anton's law matches or differs from the steps in the 8 can't wait law, if you're familiar?
Yeah, sure. Really quickly. So I think it's important for folks on the call and everyone who is concerned about the issue of police violence, who want to get justice for Anton Black and who want to help support the passage of Anton's law, we must understand that there is something that can be done at every single level of government. There's something that can be done at the federal level around police violence. As Delegate Queen alluded to earlier, the militarization of our police departments. This is a federal program. Excess Department of Defense military equipment, surplus, both used and unused, are sent to state and local police departments. And so when we talk about the militarization of our police departments, and we talk about Black communities being the most over-policed communities in America, when we see police departments and police officers looking like occupying forces, it's because of this program at the federal level. I believe it's 1033 or 1233 is the program that in essence provides state and local police departments with these excess military equipment. So there's something that can be done at the federal level. There's something that can be done at the state level. State legislatures are in the driver's seat of this issue. Everything that we want to get done, well, not everything, but most of what we want to get done around the issue of police violence, it is done at the state level. State legislatures govern what is permissible policing. And at the state and at the city or county level, to respond to the question, there is this project by Campaign Zero called 8 Can't Wait. And in essence, it's 8 recommendations that they are calling on city council members, mayors, and county councils and county executives to implement around duty to intervene, around warnings before shooting, around use of force policy and oversight, et cetera. And those things are important, and those are the things that can be done at the local level. But this issue largely must be addressed at the state level because a lot of the laws that impede police transparency and accountability and the ability of local police departments to do things are a direct result of the inadequacies of Maryland state law. And so the 8 Can't Wait is different from Anton Black in that what it's calling for is, and it's more immediate, is duty to intervene, those policies that departments can implement. It calls for warnings, it calls for a number of things, and I can't remember the entire list now, that local departments can do. But when it comes to, and I think it's important to remember that this is something that's specific to the jurisdiction that implements it. What we are trying to do is something more statewide to ensure that if there's a corrupt officer in one jurisdiction, that person isn't driving to another jurisdiction and being hired and engaging in the same behavior. And it could be in a jurisdiction that has not implemented the 8 Can't Wait recommendations. And so the difference is that Anton's law is more expansive. It's the most expansive piece of police accountability legislation introduced to date. And it does a number of things that would make it uniform statewide. And so that's important. 8 Can Wait, we should certainly be advocating for through our city and county councils and mayors and county executives. But at the end of the day, what we need is the reforming of the Maryland Public Information Act, because state law dictates how these various law enforcement agencies in Maryland should do their jobs around information sharing, et cetera. We need to repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights that impedes and prevents the kind of accountability. We need to create a special prosecutor. That cannot be done at the local level. That has to be state legislation. And we need to ensure that we're creating a database of decertified officers at the state level.
Fantastic. That's really good information to know, and particularly that they can't wait. If I was not familiar with that. LaToya, I wanted to bring you into the conversation, and you were talking a little bit about Anton's law and just about the information sharing and not being able to get certain pieces of information about your brother's death. you've touched on this a little bit before, but just if you can talk generally, do you think the law does enough? Do you wish the proposal did even more? Just what are your thoughts as someone who has been personally and directly affected by all of this?
We're happy with the way that the law is written up. You know, I believe that most of the points that, if not all of the points, have been touched by Delegate Acevero, and would be a great help, you know, in the future if we can certainly get this legislation passed. I can't think of anything else that I would want to see added to it. And, you know, we definitely just want everyone to, you know, support it and help us as best you can to go ahead and get this to go through.
And before we ask a little about what we can all do, who we need to write, who we need to call, I'm curious in terms of the pushback from, someone mentioned police unions. I imagine all of it there's pushback on, but are there particular pieces of Anton's law that have been especially sort of, you felt the force in terms of police unions not wanting it in terms of Anton's law, but then Delegate Queen, some of the other measures you talked about? Where's the most pressure and most pushback coming from? Or to what, I should ask, is probably a better way of asking.
I think most of the pushback that I'm aware of, and certainly Delegate Acevero would know more, is with the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. That was legislation that was passed early in the 70s, was updated again around in 2016. And that's really where I hear most of the issues around how do we deal with the collective bargaining piece, the things that were part of their agreement when they got hired, and change these sort of issues. And I think that's where we just have to sit down and work together on that. I think, as I alluded to, I think the work group is going to be the place where you can iron out those type of issues. But that's where I thought that's what I'm hearing is the biggest sort of a stumbling block. I think some of the other things that the bill, Anton's law, calls for are things we're looking at or have been looking at or were started in 2016 with the police accountability bill. But undoing the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights, I think is probably going to be, my thought is going to be the biggest fight.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well, Monty. And let me just say really quickly, Anton's law, we worked on this bill in collaboration with the Coalition for Justice for Anton Black. And the reason why this is important is because those closest to the pain are closest to the solution, but seldom are they closest to power, right? When we talk about folks like LaToya, Holley, and Anton Black's mother, Janelle Black, and his father, Anton Black, and his beautiful, Anton's beautiful young daughter and the community, right? This is legislation that we ensured addressed, not just started to address the inadequacy in state laws, but what was the inadequacies that led to his death and led to the lack of information, led to the kind of a cover-up we were seeing by the police department and by some town officials. This legislation was designed to address all of the concerns that the family and the community had. They were requesting information and they couldn't get any of it, right? Why is it that a family, after losing a loved one in the way that you lost, Anton Black, just such a traumatic experience, that they have to be begging and demanding information in this case? That should not be. It has to be standard in terms of, if a complainant were to request information, that complainant be provided with information, as well as any prior complaints against that officer. And I think it's important to point out that the New York State Assembly convened a special session and repealed what was called 50A, which in essence makes police misconduct records public. And this was a huge issue over the years because, again, when police investigate police, not majority of the cases, they are in essence exonerating their own, and then it is placed in a disciplinary file. No one can see it. No one is aware of these multiple use of force reports of sustained and unsustained complaints. And this officer or officers are allowed to continue to engage in that kind of behavior with impunity. So information sharing is critical here. Secondly, it's the oversight, right? A community and the family was demanding information and accountability, and there was no system in place where there was civilian oversight, and that's what we're hoping to address. And of course, use of force is important. I think there are a number of other things that we need to do around decertification of police officers. I think we need to look at police settlements because, as I said earlier, these families are paying an excruciating price with the loss of a loved one. And then the communities are paying a price because they then have to cough up the money to pay these police settlements when the families sue or when cases are brought against them, right? And it is so unjust. And we also need to look at an independent agency or how we're gonna prosecute these crimes. I know there are a number of schools of thoughts around this, and so I'm not committed to an idea, but I do know that states attorneys and district attorneys and the kind of relationships that they have with police departments and police officers, it makes it difficult in order for them to bring cases, even when cases are clear cut. And that's important as well. So I think folks need to understand why we worked on this. We worked on it with the coalition, with the family, and it is something that they've approved every step of the way. And for us to always remember that those closest to the pain, not just Anton Black's family, but Black and brown communities, those closest to the pain are closest to the solution. And we should be listening to those communities, and what those communities are calling for is the passage of Anton's Law and the repealing of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights that give these special privileges to law enforcement officers that you and I do not have.
What can we do going forward? General Assembly meets, I assume you all start meeting in January, considering COVID, but until then, who can we contact? What can we do as concerned citizens?
I'll defer to my colleague, Delegate Queen, to respond in the now.
So, several things I would suggest you do. I mean, one of the ways to get bills passed, we go back to 2016 when we did the major police accountability change. Again, as was mentioned, it was a start, but there's more that we can do. There are a lot of coalitions that, alliances that worked together on that. I mean, you had the ACLU, which is very big on police accountability issues. Back then, there was a coalition that was put together then at that time called the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability that dealt with many of these issues. Progressive Maryland is really big on looking at many of these issues, NAACP, aligning with these groups that are following these issues, have been dealing with these issues for years, are dealing with these issues, especially with the ACLU and NAACP across various states, being able to come together with those groups and have a concerted effort to get the word out, to get out how important this is very important. I think follow their websites. I'm going to their websites, following them on Facebook, but working, I think, together on those issues. I think sometimes when we have these sort of major bills that you have to kind of come together and try to work out these issues before we get to Annapolis. I think many people don't realize how important this interim period is for us as legislators. I mean, this is the time, I know I'm going to be starting in the next month working through legislation, and I'm planning to put forward. But this is the time to do that, to work out the kinks, work out the issues, making sure you know what your opposition it would be bringing up as an issue, meeting with folks and getting this out. getting the priorities of what we're going to focus on this year. Is it going to be police records? And I say this year only because a lot of the legislation that we passed, some of the major legislation we passed it the first year, and then we come back and we improve upon it in subsequent years. And so this, so the idea that you don't get everything at one time happens a lot, but that gets us starting in the right place. And so, I've seen us do that with some of the parole reform. We still aren't where we want it to be. Bail reform, we still aren't where we wanted to be, but we are incrementally getting there. And so, so maybe to look at what are the key things that you want to get done this year. Is it the records of police, making sure the police personnel records are shared across all the jurisdictions, making sure that there's bystander intervention, maybe to come to agreement on maybe what are those 4 or 5 things we have to get done this year, and then look at other parts of it in subsequent years. I think that's been a proven way of getting bills passed through Annapolis. It's a little harder than some of the city council and county councils to get bills passed because we're such a larger body, and we're dealing with a lot of bills in a given session, that 90-day session. We can have upwards of 1,200 to 1,500 bills that have to get scheduled and have to get hearings and voted through. A bill does not make it to the chamber to be voted on until it gets out of that committee. So one of the things that would be very important to do, we know that the bill, like Anton's law, is going to go to the Judiciary Committee on the House and Judiciary Proceedings in the Senate. Very important to talk to those chairs and vice chairs to make sure you get a commitment to have that bill heard. I often am working over the summer with the chairs of a committee that's going to hear my bill to make sure that my bill even gets a hearing. As I said, Judiciary probably gets about 300 to 500 bills a session to go through. So you really have to make sure you are aligned with the chairs of those committees to make sure that your bill gets heard. And then to use the advocacy of letter writing and phone calls to help you with getting the information out and making sure that folks understand this is an important, this is important for us. This is the top of the, make it the priority for NAACP, make it a priority for ACLU, make it a priority of various groups so that you have that built up alliance to get it through. So that would be my suggestion.
Well, we appreciate that, and we're running up until the end. I think that's a fantastic answer, and I think if anyone has any questions for you all, they can contact your office, Delegate Queen, Delegate Acevero. With that, I'll turn it back to Kevin and Isaac. Kevin and Isaac.
Hey, so thank you to all of our amazing panelists for taking time out to be here. I'm especially grateful to you, LaToya. Sharing grief is not something that anyone can force you to do. And like Councilmember Jawando said, it didn't stop. It is ongoing. So thank you so much for letting us into that part of your story, your family story, and then also our state story and our nation story. We can't stress enough how much we appreciate these conversations. We're hoping that everyone is benefiting from them. Our next conversation is going to be about creating change within police departments. So we're building on this conversation, and we're going to have the police chief of Montgomery County, Marcus Jones, present, and a few other stakeholders, one from the NAACP and more. And we're going to have that conversation about what is happening, what isn't happening. And so we invite you all to be a part of that conversation. So,
yeah. So just once again, thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you to both of our delegates. Will Jawando, he had to leave early, but thank you. And especially LaToya, just our hearts go out to you. If there's anything ever you absolutely need from Brothers with Books, we're right here with you in every single way to support you. And we will do everything that we can to make sure that Anton's law is heard, respected, and we continue to fight. So thank you for everybody for joining us for our part 3 of our 5-part series of Turning Anger into Action. Like Lauren said earlier, this will be on various platforms. It'll be posted on the museum and also the Brothers with Books Instagram page and on YouTube. So please feel free to join us next week for our conversation within the police department. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think Lauren may have something to say, but one thing I just wanted to add is it is important for everyone on this call to continue to have these conversations offline. It cannot stop here. It cannot be isolated. These conversations and these movements don't work if we don't work. So please do not stop here. Please keep researching Anton's law. Please research it. We need more people researching it. We need more people talking about it. So please.
And real quick, I just want to lift up Anton Black's family. Let's continue to support them. Let's continue to stand by them because they're still seeking justice. I mean, passing this law is great, and that is what we want. But the family outside of this are still trying to, put their lives back together. And that's where we come in as community. So please continue to lift up not just LaToya, but Anton's mother, his father, his daughter, right? And other family members. And make sure that we're showing up in Annapolis, because once the sensationalism around Black death sort of dissipates, and we know that happens, right? Will the people who call themselves our allies, will they show up in these spaces of power in Annapolis and demand what it is that Anton Black's family and the community and our communities have been calling for a really, really long time? And it's not just the passage of Anton's law, but please look into the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. This is a fundamentally flawed law. And anything that we want to do going forward, we have to ensure that we are repealing and replacing that. And I think now is the moment, and we can't afford to pass anything cosmetic, given what's been happening these past few months.
So Lauren, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. If you haven't registered for the next session, or if you would like to go back and watch the previous sessions, you can find those all at sandyspringmuseum.org/action, and we hope to see you guys next week. Everybody have a nice night.